Now today we're going to talk about Moses, and what we're doing is we're putting together a puzzle on how to really connect with God. That's what we're after here. And I really think everybody in the world would like to know how to really connect with God. And Moses gives us another picture of a piece in the puzzle as we sort of spin this elaborate web. And so I'm going to read the introduction here, and it says, most of us have seen Moses on the television or in the movies. His story relates to us far more than we know. His experiences are typical of the criteria for starting a relationship with God. As we explore the Passover, especially, we will be struck with the weight of details required. So let's give a little history first of where did Moses come from. Now in the book of Genesis, we have something that we call the patriarchs. Abraham had a son Isaac. Isaac had a son Jacob. Jacob had some sons. One of those was Joseph. And Joseph was, and by the way, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And at some point then we began to refer to Israel, not Jacob. But every time we refer to the children of Israel, we're talking about the children of Jacob. So, Joseph was one of the youngest of all the boys, and there were 12, and Joseph was the favorite son of his father. And he liked him best. That's just all there was to it. And all the other boys knew it, and they were jealous of that. And, you know, it's hard to have kids and not have favorites and pecking order and that kind of thing. So Jacob had favorites, and his favorite was Joseph. Well, he even made him a cool coat, you know, and a coat of many colors, and his brothers, they hated that coat, you know. And one of the things that they noticed was his dad's always showing special favor to Joseph. So one day, and Joseph in the Bible is the most, Old Testament is the most typical kind of Christ that there is in the Old Testament. 66 ways Joseph is like Jesus in the Old Testament. We don't see much fault in him, except one particular thing that he did wrong that was not really a fault. Maybe it just wasn't very wise. And here's what he did. He had a dream one night. And in this dream, he saw his brothers bowing down to him, his older brothers. So what did Joseph do? He got up in the morning, he said, hey guys, I had this cool dream last night, and guess what I saw? I saw all you guys bowing down to me. And they said, that's it, we've had it with this kid. We're going to get rid of this kid. And so they decided that, well, maybe we should kill him. And they went, nah, it's not nice to kill your brother, don't do that. What can we do? And so they finally decided to sell him into slavery. And so they sold him to a caravan going down to Egypt. And so on this journey going down to Egypt, he got in various kinds of problems and trouble here and trouble there. And it seemed like every time he turned around, he was in trouble. And he ended up in jail. But he seemed to have this skill of interpreting dreams. And so God gave him some special insight whenever somebody had a dream. And it looked like God was talking to people back then in dreams. Well, God's doing the same thing today, especially in the Muslim world. One of the things that you find in the Muslim world, if you ever find a Muslim who has become a believer in Jesus, he's had a dream of some sort. So I don't know what I know about that, except it's kind of interesting. So Joseph, during his time down there, I mean, this guy's out of his country, away from his family. He keeps end up in jail. And one day the Pharaoh had a dream, and the Pharaoh said, you know what, we need this. And they said, you know, there's a guy that can interpret dreams. His name is Joseph. I met him in prison. And Pharaoh said, let's get this guy up here. I want to know what this dream means. So he told him the dream, and he said, fat cows, and seven skinny cows. And so Joseph said, I got this. I know what this means. He said, all right, tell me what. He said, there's going to be 7 years of plenty in the land, followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh said, I think you're right. This makes perfect sense. So he said, you know, you're such a wise guy, a wise person. He said, here's what I want to do. I want to put you in charge of all this. You seem to have some wisdom about you. And so he put Joseph in charge in Egypt, this Jewish guy down in Egypt, and put him in charge of agriculture. So for 7 years, he stored away the grain and everything that they planted and grew, they stored it. And then it started, for the 7 years of famine, he began to dole it out, you see. Well, it wasn't just in Egypt, it was the whole region. And so what happened was Israel, who was told that his son Joseph was dead, said, you know, I've heard that there's corn down in Egypt. And so Joseph's brothers were sent by Israel, or Jacob, go down to Egypt and buy some corn for us. If you don't, we're going to perish for hunger. And so they got this group together of these brothers, and they went down to Egypt, and they certainly weren't expecting to see Joseph. And they didn't even know it was. So they stood up in front of Joseph, and he's in charge of the government, and he looked like an Egyptian by that time, and it had been years gone by. At least 14 years had gone, or 7, somewhere in there, a couple of decades maybe. And they didn't recognize him as their brother. And so, but he recognized them. And so he started talking with them. Hey, so what's going on? And where you from? And you got any brothers? And so like that. And he said, you got a dad? How's your father? And so he was talking with them. And then finally he said, you know, I need to tell them that I'm Joseph. And so what would you think what would you do if your brothers, you might be thinking about getting even. You know what I'm saying? And so Joseph said, look, I'm Joseph. And they went, oh, heck, this isn't going to turn out good. And he said something very wise to them. And let me tell you, in Genesis 45 and verse number 5, he said, be not grieved or angry with yourselves that you have sold me here. Listen to this statement. For God sent me before you to preserve life. What a wise statement. He recognized that all those years in prison and all the trials that he had gone through and all the trouble he was a prisoner out of his own country and held captive in a foreign land. And he said, it was the providence of God. I knew this was God's will for me. And here I have now been saving the lives of 1 million people because of this. And he said, go and get your father, whose name was Israel, and bring them down to Egypt, because when they come down to Egypt, we have plenty here. We're going to take care of them. It's going to be good. And they went, okay. So they went back and got them. When they brought them back, there were 72 people. Israel and his sons and their wives and kids and whatever, 72 people. Now, something happened. Some time went by. How much time? Well, 430 years went by. And 430 years is a long time. So 430 years later, think back in our country, 430, just go 400. Where are we 400 years ago? Well, we were just getting off the boat, weren't we? We weren't much here. So times change, don't they? And things evolve. And what happened was there arose, and there's a little verse of Scripture in Exodus 1 and verse 8. And this is one of the things I like to always refer to for people that are in business. It says, there arose a king in the land which knew not Joseph. So here's what you need to do if you're in business: get things in writing, because someday there's someone that comes along, they're not going to remember what the agreement was. And Pharaoh didn't understand the agreement. So after 400 years, there were 600,000 Jewish men now living in Egypt. And what was the promise of God to Abraham? I'm going to multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, as the sand of the sea. And all of a sudden now, this multiplication began to take place, and God was just multiplying these people like rabbits. And so the Pharaoh in the land, he got a little nervous over this whole deal. He said, if our enemy decides to come against us and makes an allegiance with these Hebrews, I mean, they can conquer us from within. They're among us. So we're going to have to, try to slow down we got to put them in their place here. So he began to try to slow down their multiplication. And he did that by taxing the men so hard with work, and he made slaves out of them. I think they probably built pyramids. I don't know what they did. But they built things, and you've seen on the History Channel all these guys towing the ropes. That's probably these people were the servants. They were the slaves. I mean, 600,000, that's a pretty good crew. Well, it didn't work. They just kept multiplying and multiplying. And so finally this Pharaoh, he came along and he said, you know what? Pharaoh put his people saying, here's what I want you to do. Every son that is born, I want you to cast him into the river. So I want you to slow this thing down. We're gonna start killing every male baby that's born. Well, that's what they do in China today, except it's the other way. In China, if you have a female, they don't even let them have, they abort them. So now there's all these guys over there can't find wives. I mean, you just can't fool Mother Nature, if you know what I mean. And so now we're killing all the male babies. And I'm going to read in Exodus chapter 2, it says, there went a man of the house of Levi, and he took a wife of the daughter of Levi. Now, one of the things we know about Levi, later on, not yet, but later on, they will become the priestly tribe of Israel. These are the ones that will manage the temple and manage the worship. And not yet, we haven't got there yet, but it's of the house of Levi, who was one of Israel's sons, Levi. It says, and she had a son, the woman conceived, and hid him for 3 months. And when she couldn't hide him anymore, she built a little ark of bulrushes. She put slime in it with pitch, and she put it in the river's edge, and then she stood afar off to see what would happen. So she made a little boat, stuck this baby in it, and shoved him out in the river. And so it says here that the sister stood afar off and kind of watched what was going on. And one day, when this took place, Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to wash herself. Now, this is the Nile River. It's not very clean. I don't know what she was washing with, but it's a dirty place. I've been there. But she saw this child, and look at this. Go get him and fetch that kid. And they brought him up, and they said, this is one of the Hebrew kids. Look at this. And the daughter ran up and said, would you like me to get someone to nurse him for you? You can keep him as your own. And Pharaoh's daughter said, yeah, why not? So this little girl went out and found Moses' mother and brought her in, and Pharaoh's daughter started paying her wages to raise this kid. How cool is that, right? Smart little girl. Well, we know now that for 40 years this took place. And he grew up in Pharaoh's palace. And he was a part of that whole world. He was a part of the important people. You know, he had the chariot with the spinners on it, you know, and all the cool hubcaps and all the accessories and the AM/FM stereo and the Sirius radio. He had all the cool things because he was Pharaoh's household. Well, one day what happened was, I'm sure after 40 years of listening to his mother talk, you know, you're not one of them. You're one of us. I just want you to know that. Don't ever lose your identity. And so one day he saw one of the Egyptians and he was beating a Hebrew. And he said, this ain't right. And he looked this way, it says, and he looked that way, and he went out and he killed the Egyptian. And he hit him in the sand. And he went, took care of that. And so the next day he saw it going on again. He said, oh my gosh. And so what he did ultimately was he had delivered one Hebrew in his own power, and that's all he could do. And the next day he approached another Egyptian that was doing the same thing. And the other Egyptian said, you're going to kill me like you did the other guy the other day? He went, oh, you knew about that? Oh, man, he said, I'm kind of busted here, so I guess my time here is over. So he packed up and left, got out of town. All right, so for 40 years, he's in the Pharaoh's house. The next 40, he's out in the wilderness as a shepherd. So he's 80 years old, and after a while, these Hebrews are starting to cry before God, and they're being afflicted by the Egyptians, and oh my gosh. And so one day, I'm reading in chapter 3 of Exodus, now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert, and he came to a mountain of God, even called Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burned with fire, but the bush wasn't consumed. And Moses said, well, I got to see this great sight. Why isn't the bush consumed? And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the midst of the bush. And he said, Moses, Moses. He said, here am I, Lord. He said, draw not near the bush, put your shoes off from your feet, for the place you're walking on is holy ground. And moreover, he said, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of your people that are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. I know their sorrows. And he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go down there yourself, and I want you to deliver these people. I want you to deliver them out of bondage. He went, what? You got the wrong guy. I mean, I'm not very good talking, and I don't know if I can make a good speech. He said, all right, I'll send Aaron, your brother, with you. And he said, and so here's Moses and Aaron, and as far as we know, Aaron never got to talk. Moses kind of got on a roll, And he said, when I'm talking to these Hebrews, who am I going to say sent me? And he said, you tell them that I am sent you. And I like that, because in the Hebrew world now, the term I am, those are words that you just don't ever use in the Hebrew world, because they represent the name of God. I am. In fact, when you get to the New Testament, every time Jesus said, I am, they wanted to kill him for it. I'm the bread of life. I am the way. I am the door. Every time they said it, they went, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy's using those words. And I like the fact that I am. It's not I was or I'm going to be. It's sort of perpetual, isn't it? I am. I am. That's it. So he said, I want you to go down there and I want you to deliver these people. And he went, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm cut out for this. And so when you think about it, though, there was nobody else that was more cut out for it than he was, because he grew up in the Pharaoh's house. He knew the people. He knew their ways. He knew the whole deal, you see. So he went down there and he stood before the Pharaoh, and you know what he said? He said, God sent me here to tell you to let my people go. And Pharaoh said, go where? What are you talking about? He said, we just want to go. We want to leave your land. And he said, what? That's ridiculous. I mean, you guys are my servants. You're You're building my world and my cities, and let you go? I'm not going to let you go. And so a series of contests began to happen now because God began to curse the land of Egypt and the Pharaoh and the family for his stiff-necked resistance. And there were 10 plagues in all, and we'll talk about the last one in a minute, but the first 9, one of them was the river turned to blood, and the sun turned red, and lice showed up everywhere, and frogs turned up. So there's 4 of them. So all these things began to happen, and boils, and and in truth, what was going on was God was attacking each of the gods of Egypt and putting them down, showing his superiority. Because they worshiped the sun god, that was called Ra. They worshiped the Nile River. They worshiped the frog. All these things they worshiped. And they were part of their god system. And what God did was put them all down. And for years, decades, millennium after this, every time they wanted to make a reference to the power of God, they kept saying, remember the Exodus. Remember the Exodus. Remember what happened? Yeah. So we got all these plagues going on, and finally the Pharaoh is starting to wear down, And so the last one is in chapter 12, and this is the one that we call the Passover. So let's see what happened. I'm in chapter 12, and here's what it said. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, he said, this month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. So what's going on? He's starting the calendar over. He's saying we're going to have a new year. This is going to be the Jewish New Year. And we have that today. It's called Rosh Hashanah. It's the Jewish New Year. Okay? And it says, speak unto the congregation of Israel and say to them, now so God's telling Moses what to say. Say this, in the 10th day of this month, you shall take to every man a lamb according to the house of his fathers, a lamb for a house. If the lamb's too big, you're going to share it with your neighbors, etc. Verse 5, it says, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year, and you're going to take it out of the sheep and from the goats, and you shall keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. So he's saying, here's what I want you to do. I want you to offer a big sacrifice, and I want you to and we know we've got pictures of Jesus going on here, because later John the Baptist is going to point to Jesus and say, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And what would they have thought about this Passover? They would have thought about this practice and the Passover lamb being slain. They would have made that connection if they were spiritually astute. Some were, some weren't. So he says, and here's the semblance here, a male without blemish. Well, that's Jesus. And I want you to take it, keep it up until the 14th day of the same month, the whole assembly of Israel. He said, then I want you to take the blood, and I want you to put it on the doorposts and on the upper doorpost. And then that night, I want you to cook this thing, and I want you to eat it. So we've got this blood on the doorpost, right? They've been catching the blood in a basin, putting it on the doorpost. And he said, then I want you to eat it, and I want you to be ready to go, because we're doing this fast, because this is the Lord's Passover. So now the word Passover shows up. It says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and I'm going to smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt. Here we go. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the... Well, we've got a token going on here. Remember this now. We got a token to remember. This is a picture of something, a reminder of something. He said, and when I see the blood, I'm going to pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. So he's saying that I'm going through the land, and when I get there, if I look at the door and I don't see any blood, the firstborn is going to die in that house. Not just people, animals. This is going to be a horrible night. This is going to be the worst night in human history. Just walking through the land, and all of a sudden people are dying and wailing and crying out. Now, here's a question, and I just want you to ponder this. And the question is, who do you think is the most interested person that night? Who has the most interest in what's going on that night? Who do you think? You want to take a guess? Go ahead. Take a guess. Let's hear it. Think about it. Everybody but you. Moses, or that? Yeah, he'd certainly be interested. Anybody else? The most interested, though. No, William.
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh would be interested for sure because he's already seen the hand of God. But I think the person that would be the most interested would be the firstborn. Because he's going to go, oh man, I got the most at stake here, you know. I hope this thing turns out good. And even in the Hebrew family, I think that firstborn would walk outside and check that door out, and he'd say, now, Dad, you got any more of that blood? I see a spot over here. I think you might have missed this, you know. And did we get this right? We got the right lamb, didn't we? You know, and I'm concerned. And why would that be? Because he has the most at stake. Now, here's the lesson of this. Now get this, nail this down. This is a picture of salvation. And here's what I want you to know. When it comes to salvation, you got to get it right. This is no time to trust religion, because religion's going to mess you up. Because this group says that, this group says that, this next group's got another thing. You got to make it based upon God's Word, otherwise you're going to screw it up. And there's too much at stake to get it wrong, if you know what I mean. So there's details. And we're going to talk about those as we develop this thought. Now, I'm going to run real quick to Luke chapter 22, and I'm going to, by the way, one more verse. And this day shall be unto you, I'm in verse 14, Exodus 12:14. This day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast, making an ordinance forever. So he's saying we're establishing a reminder of what's going on here. And what we're going to do is every year on the same day, we're going to slay a lamb, and we're going to offer the blood, and we're going to make a sacrifice, and we're going to have it, and we're calling it Passover, because the death angel will pass over. And so I want you to be reminded of this. All right, so how long did they do this? Well, we know that this experience was 1441 BC. BC. Well, I'm going to get rid of the BC and we're going to go to C, right? So I'm going to Luke chapter 22, which would be 1400 years later. That means they have practiced this thing for 1400 years. Kill the lamb, done the deal, 1400 years, right? All right, so 1400 years later, I'm in Luke 22, it says, and the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. Here we are, we're observing the Passover. It said, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill Jesus, for they feared the people. Then entered Satan into Judas Iscariot, and they went out. This is the Passover. So guess what happened? The Passover is when Jesus died. He died on the Passover. Why is that? Because he was the Passover. It had to happen on the Passover. It had to be right on cue on the Passover. And the night that he was experiencing, and I'm going to look in Matthew 23, I think. Let me back up here. In Matthew 23, here's what it says. And no, is it Matthew 23? It's not Matthew 23. Oh, it's 26. Here we go. And so I'm in Matthew 26, let me find a verse here. 26. Now I'm going to back up. It says, now the first day, I'm in 26:17. Now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and said, where shall we prepare to eat the Passover? So this is what this is about. And he said, you go into a city, there's going to be a man there, and you say that the master says, my time is at hand. Now for this whole life of Jesus so far, he's been saying, my time is not yet. My time is not my time yet. And now all of a sudden he's saying, this is it. My time is drawn near. This is it. And I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And I'm jumping down to verse 26. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and he blessed it and he broke it and he gave it to the disciples. He said, take, eat. This is my body. What's going on here? They're observing the Passover. And he's trying to say that everything you've been observing for the last 1,400 years, you have been observing my death. Because the lamb that was killed was me. And now I'm going to show you how it comes to a conclusion. And he said, and he took the cup and he gave thanks and he said, drink all of it. This is the blood of the New Testament, which is shed for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not henceforth drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. What a cool statement. So what they were observing was, listen, to the last Passover and the first communion all at the same time. Cool. Because I'm going to fast forward now to Matthew chapter 17, and I want you to see what took place, and I want you to get a picture of Moses here at the very end, and this is the glorification of Jesus. He said, now after 6 days, Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John, his brother, and they brought him up into a high mountain apart, and he was transfigured there before him, and his face did shine as the sun, and his clothes as the white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elijah talking with him. I mean, what's going on here? Here's Peter, James, and John. All of a sudden, Jesus sort of assumes his natural glory. And Moses showed up. 1,400 years later, Elijah, 700 years after his death, showed up. And Peter said, Lord. Now this is Peter. He's always shooting off his mouth. You know, you can always count on Peter. He's going to talk when he shouldn't be talking, right? He says, Lord, it's good that we should be here. Let's make 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And while he spoke, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. Behold, a voice out of the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. In other words, shut up, Peter. You know, you talk too much. You talk when you ought to be listening, you know. And he said, I want you to hear him. When the disciples heard that, they fell on their face. Oh my gosh. And they were afraid, it says. And Jesus came and touched them and said, arise and be not afraid. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no man except Jesus only. Now, okay, so what is happening here? Why is this why these 2 guys? Because they represented something. Moses represented the law. Elijah represents the prophets. And the law and the prophets can never take away a person's sin. When it's all said and done, the ultimate sacrifice is Jesus only. There he is. That's all that's left. You get rid of the law, you get rid of the prophets. And I've often wondered what Jesus said to Moses and Elijah. And I've got this figured out. I've been thinking about this for 40 years. He said to them, I got this now, fellas. Thank you. I'll take it from here. Which is cool. Because they had served their purpose. They had done what they were supposed to do. Now Jesus is there about to fulfill the law. And on the Passover, he went to the cross, and this Lamb of God was slain, and he took away the sin of all the world. And we need to know this, and what we need to do is make sure we get these details right. So I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 11 now, because this is sort of that same memorial. It's not really named communion, but listen to it. And said, for this is Paul talking. He said, for I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you. The Lord Jesus, the same night when he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. Now, I think it's important that we understand why he did this. He did this as a reminder. Now, be careful here, because this is a highly charged religious statement. He didn't say, if you'll take this, then your sins will be forgiven. What he said, no, that's not what I'm doing here. What I'm doing is I'm reminding you of going to the cross. I want you to remember this. This is some kind of experience. Because on the cross, what happened? Well, life and death collided. Eternity and time crisscrossed. And righteousness and sin had hit head on. And the greatest transaction of the world was made. The sin debt of all the world was paid. And after the same manner also he took the cup when he supped, saying, this is the New Testament in my blood. He said, as often as you do it, do this in remembrance of me. And he said, and here's how long. I want you to do this until I come again. I want you to think about this experience, this death, until I come again. All right, so what we know is that what Moses is showing us here then is a demonstration of what Jesus would do 1,400 years later. And we know that the experience of this was designed to pay the sin debt for the world. That's it. The debt is paid. Now, but wait a minute, it's like somebody paying off your loan and you're not going in and signing off on it. It's really, it's sort of on deposit for everybody, but a person has to claim it. And we'll talk about how that works next week and the week after.